Welcome back to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Seikel. In this episode, I'm talking about thinking differently in Chinese. As my Chinese was getting better, I didn't quite feel so often that I was hitting a plateau, that I couldn't progress any further, but it was still happening from time to time. I came to a point when I was very busy at work and did not have much time. At first, I felt that it didn't make much of a difference. The vocabulary was still being learned automatically as I was watching movies and hearing words that I had heard before. But then I felt that some vocab learning was needed. It just helped to speed up the process, and it was easier to remember that I had seen a word before when I had seen it in my vocabulary list and in my dictionary program. I've before talked about Chinese being quite different from the other languages I've learned, but I could still use my learning experience to date in help me guide learning Chinese. I could use the strategies that I had previously found useful. I could also compare Chinese to other languages I knew and go, oh, Chinese word order is just like English under these specific circumstances. Or, oh, in Chinese, this idiom is similar to the English one. Wow. And also, oh, the Chinese word de is very similar to the Spanish word de, both being used in cases of possession, and then noting the similarities but also the differences of how these words occur. Sometimes these similarities were purely coincidental, as I think is the case with de, but others were linked in some other way, and sometimes this has to do with frequencies in language structures. Languages across the world, it turns out, have a lot of things in common. And often there are structures that are much more frequent in some languages. As a typologist, so someone who studies the languages of the world and the similarities and the differences in their grammars and other aspects of language, this was familiar to me. And I could note where Chinese was just like most other languages or standing out in an interesting way. All of this previous knowledge really helped me. But then something very interesting started. Chinese started to influence my other languages. I started noticing an ever so slight difference in my spoken English. Whereas before, English had become the most natural language for me. I was using it daily at home and for work. And obviously I was still using German with my daughter. But now there were a number of instances where I was stumbling over my words in English and where I struggled to phrase things correctly. It almost felt like my brain was getting lazy and just went off on one, doing something I was not expecting. And that something had to do with Chinese. How utterly peculiar. I've discussed language attrition in a previous episode, and in a very small way this was similar. This was happening to my English. For example, I started to use Chinese-style relative clauses in English. Relative clauses are these little clauses that explain something about a noun. So you can say something like, the man who lives next door. And who lives next door tells us something about the man. Easy enough. We've got them in English, we've got them in many other languages. However, Chinese does things slightly differently. While Chinese has relative clauses, these would appear before the noun and not after the noun as in English. So, the man who lives next door in Chinese would be the who lives next door man. The relative clause would appear before the noun. At first I was quite intrigued by this structure because it went against some structural issues that we find in the languages of the world. But then I soon got used to it. But I realized that I was now starting to use similar sentences in English, or at least my brain was getting me to use these sentences in English. And it was quite bizarre because I felt like saying, oh, the next door man or the who lives next door man. At other times there were words that I had now learned in Chinese that didn't exist in English or distinctions that weren't quite the same. And there were things I really wanted to express that I now couldn't express in English, whereas in Chinese I would have been able to do so. So, for example, a colleague of mine was lamenting on social media that he could not go and do field work after all. Commenting on the post, I tried to say, oh, but I thought that you were finally able to go back there. But something didn't quite feel right. I sort of needed a stronger indication that I had thought differently from the current reality. I had assumed that he would be able to go. I needed the Chinese word iwei, assume wrongly, rather than zhenwei, to think or assume rightly. I guess in English assume fulfills a similar role, but in my limited knowledge, not quite the same way as I was learning to use in the Chinese version. So this distinction wasn't there, and at that moment I really needed it. Had my colleague been able to speak Chinese, I would just have put iwei in brackets to make it clear that I wrongly assumed. But I couldn't do this in this situation. Rather, I felt like writing, "Oh, but I wrongly assumed that you would be able to go," which again didn't quite sound right. I was taken aback by this. Chinese was starting to creep in, quite obviously, into my English, which I was speaking daily. This need for some words is quite interesting, and languages can have different ways of arranging things and organizing the world. There is a clear connection between the languages you speak and the way you're thinking, and this is just one of the examples of how that can go about. Linguists have long known that there is some connection between the languages you speak and the way you think. This is often referred to as linguistic relativity, and there are various approaches to it. Imagine you are a speaker of Finnish, which does not distinguish between gender, and there are no gendered pronouns, he, she, or it in Finnish either. It's all hen. Finnish speakers, then, often muddle up he and she when they speak English, just simply because the distinction does not exist in their language. This is similar for Chinese speakers, by the way, as well, where ta is used all the way for he, she, and it in the spoken language. But when it comes to the written language, distinctions have been developed to distinguish between he, she, and it, so making the gender clear in the written language. When a speaker of English talks about someone, though, they will always have to know their gender, simply because it's so ingrained in the language. So, in order to use a pronoun, he or she, you have to know the gender of the person you're speaking about. Of course, in recent years, the generic pronoun they has become much more frequent and is used by non-binary people to refer to themselves. And indeed, it's also used in situations where the gender is unknown or downplayed, and has been used in this way for a long time. But primarily, until recently, the default has always been he or she, and the gender incredibly important. Thus, the English brain is steered towards finding out the gender of someone, because it is so ingrained in the language system. For Finnish speakers, on the other hand, this is totally different. There is no need to know the gender of someone to speak about them. There is no distinction in the grammar, so gender is not important. And the outcome of this is that speakers of Finnish and speakers of English think about the world very differently when it comes to gender. It is essential for speakers of English to find out the gender, where it is irrelevant for speakers of Finnish to find out the gender of the person they're talking about. So, the world is classified in a very different way, and thought is influenced depending on the language you speak. I find this fascinating, and I've experienced the effects across languages. But what is also quite cool is how this can at times be quite confusing, such as in the case of our speaker of Finnish confusing he and she in English. One area where I struggled with Chinese and where I was confused by the way things were organized slightly differently is that there's no direct distinction between past, present, and future in standard Chinese. So, verbs are not marked for where they are in time. Of course, there is something called aspect. This means the way an action is carried out, whether it is ongoing, whether it has stopped, whether it is merely starting. But there is no tense. This can be quite easy because you don't have to learn to say all those complicated grammatical forms. I go, I went, I will go. But on the other hand, it can also be quite difficult because you don't always know what people are referring to, and you may miss out some very important background information. The way Chinese gets around this is by using other markers, for example before and after. But even these are slightly tricky. Xia, which is below, it means below, and shang, which means above, can be used in this way. Below refers to after, next, and above refers to before, last. So last week would be on or above week. Next week would be under or below week. I learned these expressions in context and kept stumbling over them, despite looking at them clearly and trying to memorize them. For example, trying to put them into images in my head. The past hangs above me and things like that. I still struggled with them at times, and they really interfered a lot in the way I was speaking Chinese and understanding Chinese, and I kept getting them wrong. And one situation exemplifies this quite well. At that point, I had not seen the Chinese lady in my village for a while, and since she was one of the first people I had dared speaking Chinese to, I was looking forward to see her again and show off my improvements in the language. The opportunity arose at the allotments in spring, and her husband were out there tending to their allotment that was much better than mine, of course. I walked over and had a quick chat with her husband in English and then proceeded to speaking to her in Chinese. She seemed a bit surprised at first and didn't say much, but then happily chatted away with me for about 30 minutes or so. This was just after I had been to China, and I was keen to tell her about our experiences in the country. She asked when we were going, and I said, last week, we've just come back. But, unfortunately I used the wrong form again. I said 下个星期, next week, without realizing. Because below and above, I really could not distinguish between them with respect to before and after. I did say we've only just come back, but I guess this can be interpreted in other ways as well. Anyway, I then told her at length about our experiences in the country, and she told me other things. And when leaving, she said, well, you have to tell me all about your trip to China when you come back. Huh? I was dumbstruck. I had just told her all about my trip to China after coming back. Then it dawned on me that I had again confused xia and shang. Analyzing the conversation in forensic detail afterwards, I realized that I had been speaking about the past, but with there being no tense marking as such, it could have been interpreted as something in the future. The few inconsistencies, such as clear details such as, on the last day I bought 15 books, could always be analyzed as a rather peculiar plan. I am going to buy 15 books on the last day, I guess. Oh no, I had been so pleased to show off my Chinese, and then this. I did feel slightly deflated, but at the same time I saw the ridiculous side to this. And misunderstandings happen, even in your native language. Our brains have the ability to skim over some inconsistencies, and then in hindsight, I realized that I had done just the same with her when she was speaking, as she was clearly asking about our plans, and in no unclear, misunderstandable terms. I just thought it was amazing that we could have gone through such a long time speaking with such a big misunderstanding. It would not have happened in languages with inflectional or even any other types of past tense marking, that's for sure.